Everyone was praying for her body. No one knew her soul was bleeding. That was the part no one talked about. Not in the waiting rooms, not in the whispered prayers, not even in the well-meaning messages that flooded her phone every morning with the same words. Stay strong. God will heal you. They were right about one thing. She needed healing. They were just looking in the wrong place. Her name was Margaret Hale, and until 6 months ago, she had been invisible in the way most people are when life is steady. She lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Madison, Wisconsin, in a modest blue house with white shutters and a maple tree that dropped its leaves like clockwork every October. She worked as a librarian at the local community college, a job that suited her love for order, quiet, and stories that made sense in the end. Margaret believed in God, but not loudly. Her faith was private, thoughtful, practical. She prayed the way some people breathe, naturally, without ceremony, until breathing became hard. The pain started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with drama. It arrived as a dull pressure beneath her ribs, something easy to dismiss. By Friday, it had a name. By Monday, it had a treatment plan. By Wednesday, it had rearranged her entire life. Doctors spoke in careful sentences, charts filled with numbers. Hallways smelled like antiseptic and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. The diagnosis wasn't immediately fatal, but it wasn't kind either. It came with words like chronic, aggressive, and long-term management. The kind of illness that doesn't just attack the body, it negotiates with your future. Margaret listened. She nodded. She asked the right questions. She did not cry, not in the doctor's office, not in the parking lot, not even when she got home and sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at a stack of mail she suddenly didn't care about. What broke her didn't come until later that night. It came when she reached for her phone. There was a message from her sister in Des Moines, another from a coworker, then another, and another. I'm praying for your healing. God is going to restore your body. You'll beat this. Margaret stared at the screen, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from something heavier, because her body wasn't the part that felt broken. The truth was, Margaret had been unraveling long before the diagnosis. No one knew that 3 years earlier, she had stood in this same kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, listening to her husband tell her he was leaving. He spoke calmly, kindly even, as if explaining a scheduling conflict instead of ending a marriage that had lasted over 20 years. He said things like, I need to find myself, and this isn't about you. But it had felt very much about her. She never told anyone how that night hollowed her out, how she learned to sleep on only one side of the bed, how silence became louder than arguments ever were. She survived it the way she survived most things, quietly. Then came her mother's death. Sudden, a stroke, no goodbye, no last conversation to make peace with the words they never said. Margaret had been the one to identify the body, the one to organize the funeral, the one everyone leaned on. And she had leaned on no one. Grief stacked on grief until it felt normal, until it didn't. Now, lying in a hospital bed under fluorescent lights, Margaret wondered something she had never dared to say out loud. What if this illness wasn't the beginning of her suffering? What if it was only the moment everyone finally noticed? The nurses were kind. One of them, a woman named Claire, adjusted her IV with practiced ease and spoke in a gentle Midwestern accent that reminded Margaret of home. You've got a lot of people praying for you, Claire said with a smile. Margaret nodded. Yes, she replied. She didn't say what she was thinking. She didn't say that every prayer she'd heard lately sounded like a plea for her body to be fixed, while the deeper ache inside her went unnamed, unseen, untouched. That night, sleep refused to come. Machines hummed softly around her, keeping rhythm like an unwanted lullaby. Her mind replayed moments she had never processed, words she never said, apologies no one ever asked for, guilt that had no clear origin but lived in her chest like a second heart. At some point, between exhaustion and surrender, she whispered something into the darkness. It wasn't a prayer she had practiced. It didn't sound holy. It sounded honest. God, she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the machine's, everyone wants you to heal my body. But if you're listening, I need you to heal whatever this is. Her hand pressed against her chest. I don't even know what's broken anymore. Silence followed. Not the empty kind. The kind that feels like being heard. Margaret didn't see a light. She didn't hear a voice. There was no sudden warmth or dramatic sign, but something shifted. It began as a sense, subtle, almost dismissible, that she was not alone in the room. The air felt heavier, not oppressive, but present, as if the space around her had filled with meaning. Her breathing slowed. The tension she had been holding in her shoulders for years loosened just enough for her to notice it had been there at all. And then, a thought entered her mind that did not feel like her own. Not in words, in understanding. You have been carrying pain that was never meant to be carried alone. Tears streamed down her face before she realized she was crying. For the first time since the diagnosis, since the divorce, Since her mother's death, Margaret didn't try to be strong. She let herself break. She cried for the version of herself that believed endurance was the same as healing. She cried for all the prayers she never prayed because she didn't want to bother God with feelings that seemed too complicated. She cried because something inside her finally had permission to come undone. And in that unraveling, something unseen drew near. The angel of healing did not come for her illness, not yet. He came for the wound beneath it. Margaret would later struggle to explain what happened that night. There were no wings, no names, no dramatic declarations, only the unmistakable sense of being known completely and loved without conditions. As dawn crept through the narrow hospital window, Margaret slept for the first time in weeks. Not the shallow sleep of exhaustion, the deep, restorative kind. The kind that feels like mercy. When she woke, the pain in her body was still there, but something else was gone. The weight, the shame, the unspoken belief that she had to suffer quietly to deserve healing. That morning, when Claire returned to check her vitals, she noticed the difference immediately. "You look lighter," she said, pausing mid-task. Margaret smiled softly. "I think," she replied, choosing her words carefully, "something important happened last night." Claire nodded as if she understood more than she said. Sometimes healing begins long before the body catches up. And sometimes the miracle everyone is waiting for is not the one heaven delivers first. Healing did not arrive all at once. It never does. If anyone had asked Margaret what changed after that night, she wouldn't have known how to answer without disappointing them. There was no miracle she could point to on a chart. No numbers dramatically reversed. No doctor stepping into the room with a stunned expression and a word like remarkable hanging in the air. Her body still hurt. Her diagnosis was still real. The treatment still came with side effects that made her nauseous, exhausted, and bone-deep tired in a way sleep could not fix. But something inside her had shifted its posture. Instead of bracing for impact, her soul had exhaled. Margaret began to notice it in small, almost insignificant ways. The kind of ways people usually ignore because they don't look like answers. She stopped apologizing for needing help. When her sister drove in from Des Moines to stay with her for a few days, Margaret didn't rush to reassure her that everything would be fine. She didn't minimize. She didn't perform strength. She said, "I'm scared," and let the words sit in the room without trying to fix them. Her sister cried. Not because Margaret was dying, but because she was finally telling the truth. At the hospital, Margaret started paying attention to moments she had once rushed through. The way sunlight moved across the linoleum floor in the late afternoon. The quiet ritual of nurses changing shifts. The sound of someone laughing softly in the hallway, life insisting on itself even here. It felt as if a veil had been lifted, not dramatically, but gently. One afternoon, during a long infusion session, Margaret found herself staring at a painting mounted on the far wall. It was unremarkable. A landscape, rolling hills, a river cutting through the center. She had passed it dozens of times without noticing. Now she couldn't look away. It stirred something old. She remembered being a child, standing on the edge of a creek near her grandmother's house in rural Illinois. She remembered the feeling of water rushing past her ankles, the sense that time slowed when she was there, safe, held, unafraid. The memory hit her with such force that she had to close her eyes, and then she felt it again, that presence, not pressing, not overwhelming, simply near. There were no words this time, only a knowing. Healing is happening, even when you cannot feel it. Margaret swallowed hard. For the first time, she realized how much of her life had been spent waiting for permission to rest, to grieve, to be unfinished. She had believed healing was something you earned through endurance. The angel of healing was gently dismantling that belief. Her doctor, Dr. Raymond Collins, was a practical man in his late 50s with a calm voice and the kind of confidence that came from decades of experience. He didn't speak in absolutes. He didn't promise outcomes. But during one appointment, as he reviewed her latest labs, he paused longer than usual. "These numbers," he said slowly, tapping the page, "they're not what I expected at this stage." Margaret's heart jumped. "Is that good?" she asked cautiously. "It's not a cure," he replied honestly, "but it's stabilization. And in your case, that matters." Margaret nodded, absorbing the words. Stabilization. It wasn't the miracle everyone was praying for, but it was movement. Later that evening, alone again in her room, Margaret whispered into the quiet. "Thank you," she said. Not for the numbers, for the process. She was beginning to understand something most people never do until they are forced to slow down. Healing is not an event. It's a relationship. And it demands honesty. The hardest part came a few days later when a hospital chaplain stopped by. He was a gentleman with kind eyes and a habit of listening more than he spoke. He asked if she wanted prayer. Margaret hesitated. "Yes," she said, "but not for my body." The chaplain raised an eyebrow, surprised but open. "Then what would you like prayer for?" Margaret took a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for years. for the parts of me I buried so I could survive." The chaplain didn't rush. He prayed slowly, carefully, not with grand language, but with reverence for pain that had gone unnamed for too long. As he spoke, images surfaced in Margaret's mind. Her younger self shrinking her needs to keep peace, swallowing grief to be dependable, choosing silence because it was safer than being seen. Each memory felt like a knot loosening. She cried again, but this time there was relief in it. After that day, Margaret began journaling, not about symptoms or appointments, but about the things she had never allowed herself to feel: regret, anger, loneliness, even resentment toward God, something she had once believed was unforgivable. She wrote it all, and nothing bad happened. God did not withdraw. Healing did not stop. The presence did not leave. If anything, it felt closer. One evening, during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and painted the sky in flashes of white, Margaret asked the question that had been forming quietly in her heart. "Why now?" she whispered. The answer didn't come as explanation. It came as clarity. "Because now you are listening." She realized then that the angel of healing had not arrived when her body broke. He arrived when her defenses did, when she finally stopped demanding strength from herself and allowed truth to take its place. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's condition remained serious but steady. Treatments continued. Some days were harder than others. There were setbacks, moments of fear that returned without warning. But she was no longer fighting alone. She had learned to name what hurt. She had learned that faith was not pretending everything was fine. It was trusting that honesty would not disqualify her from grace. One afternoon, while sitting by the window watching snow begin to fall, Margaret smiled to herself. She understood now why the healing everyone could see had taken longer, because heaven had chosen to start where it mattered most. Healing does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or certainty. It comes quietly, often unnoticed, slipping into the spaces where resistance once lived. Margaret learned this slowly. There was no single morning when she woke up and realized she was better. No clear line between before and after. Instead, there were days that felt almost normal again, followed by days that reminded her how fragile progress could be. But something fundamental had changed. Fear no longer ruled her decisions. When pain came, she acknowledged it without panic. When exhaustion weighed her down, she rested without guilt. She stopped treating her body like an enemy that needed to be conquered and began treating it like a companion that had carried her through more than anyone realized. The angel of healing did not rush her. He never had. Margaret noticed his presence most clearly in moments that used to unravel her. Waiting rooms, test results, the sound of her name being called in a quiet hallway. Places that once tightened her chest now felt manageable. Not easy, but held. One afternoon, Dr. Collins walked into the exam room with an expression Margaret had not seen before. Not excitement, not shock, cautious hope. "We're seeing continued improvement," he said, placing her chart down carefully. "Not remission, not yet, but enough that I'm comfortable adjusting your treatment plan." Margaret listened, nodding, absorbing the words. Adjusting, forward motion? It was the first time she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by illness. That night, back at home in her blue house with the white shutters, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed and let the quiet settle around her. The maple tree outside tapped gently against the window, just as it always had. She realized something then. This house no longer felt like a place she was waiting to leave behind. It felt like a place she was still meant to live in. She whispered into the stillness. "I see it now," she said. "The healing didn't start when my body changed. It started when I stopped hiding." The presence came again, familiar now, comforting in its steadiness. Healing follows honesty. Margaret smiled. In the months that followed, progress continued. Not without struggle, not without setbacks, but with resilience that surprised even her doctors. She began walking again, slowly at first, around her neighborhood. She returned to the library part-time, surrounded by books and quiet conversations that felt like home. People told her she looked well, stronger. They asked her what had changed. Margaret never knew how to answer in a way that would make sense to everyone, so she kept it simple. "I learned how to let myself heal." What she didn't say was that the deepest miracle had already happened, long before her body responded. She had forgiven herself for staying too long in a marriage that hollowed her out, for not grieving loudly enough, for believing strength meant silence. The angel of healing had never asked her to be brave, only honest. And in that honesty, something sacred took root. One evening, as Margaret stood watching the sunset stretch across the Wisconsin sky in soft shades of gold and blue, she felt it clearly. The same understanding that had arrived in the hospital room months earlier. You were never broken beyond repair. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from awe. She realized that even if her body had never healed the way everyone hoped, the miracle would still have been real. Because healing is not measured only in years added to life. Sometimes it's measured in life added to years. Margaret did not know what the future held, but she no longer feared it. She had learned that miracles do not always arrive as answers to the prayers everyone is praying. Sometimes they arrive as answers to the prayers we were too afraid to speak. And sometimes the angel of healing comes not to remove the pain we can see, but to heal the wound beneath it so that everything else can finally begin to follow. If this story found you in a moment of waiting, uncertainty, or quiet pain, allow it to remind you of this. Healing may already be closer than you think, and if stories like this speak to your heart, you're always welcome here. With love, Signs of Heaven.